I want to start with a number: 5,390 pounds. That is the curb weight of the 2025 BMW M5. The sports sedan. The driver's car. The car with the racetrack in every advertisement and 40 years of motorsport heritage in every press release. 5,390 pounds. A Ford F-150, America's best-selling truck, the vehicle that builds construction sites and hauls boats and does actual work in the actual world, weighs 5,096 pounds. The BMW M5 is heavier than a full-size work truck. Not comparable, not close. Heavier. And nobody at BMW is embarrassed about this. Nobody at the regulatory agencies that approved it is embarrassed about it. Because under the emissions rules that govern what cars get built and sold, this made perfect sense. A 2.5-ton sports sedan that drinks fuel like a ship and needs a separate charging cable to pretend otherwise is considered responsible progress. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Mazda MX-5 Miata, a car weighing just over 1,000 kilograms, 1,000 kilos, a car so light it is essentially a bicycle with a roof, had its engine taken away because it could not survive the same regulatory system. Heavier is cleaner, bigger is greener. A work truck is lighter than a sports sedan. I am going to show you exactly how that happened. Not the version where regulators made an honest mistake. The version with the receipts. A few years ago, someone in a forum I was in posted real-world fuel consumption data showing that modern cars consistently use 20 to 30% more fuel than their official figures. He had numbers, he had sources, he was calm and specific. I told him he was probably driving wrong. I am not proud of that. I say it because I need you to understand where I was before I looked at the actual data, before I read the EU Commission's own published reports, before I found the footnotes in NHTSA's own regulatory documents, before I understood what the International Council on Clean Transportation had been trying to say for a decade, while most of the car media world ignored them. I was defending a system I had never examined. I was confident about something I had never checked. And I was doing it publicly, in ways that made it slightly harder for the truth to reach people. I do not think I am unusual in that. I think that is exactly what the system was designed to produce. Here is what I found when I actually looked. In Europe, the CO2 regulations that govern which cars get built reward manufacturers for making heavier vehicles. In the United States, the CAFE fuel economy standards reward manufacturers for making bigger vehicles. Different names, different agencies, different continents. Identical structural logic. And the real-world data, now collected by mandatory sensors fitted to millions of cars, shows that official fuel economy figures are systematically disconnected from what actually happens when you fill up. This video is about how both of those things came to exist, who built them, what they were actually for, and why the fact that you probably defended one of them at some point is not your fault, but also is not an accident. I will start with Europe, because the mechanism is slightly more visible there. EU regulations require every manufacturer to keep their average CO2 emissions below a fleet target, currently around 93 grams per kilometer. If you miss it, you pay €95 per excess gram per car sold. Miss by 10 grams across a fleet of 1 million cars, and you owe nearly €1 billion. The threat is real, and it shapes every product decision a car company makes. But the target is not the same number for every car. It adjusts upward with vehicle weight. Heavier car, higher permitted CO2. That adjustment is called the weight correction factor, and it is written directly into the regulation. The official justification was fairness. A small city car and a large family estate should not face identical absolute limits. That justification is reasonable on its surface. The consequence is not. Because once your regulatory ceiling rises with weight, you have built a commercial incentive to add weight. Every extra kilogram in Europe nudges a manufacturer's permitted emissions upward. Every ton of battery, every reinforced chassis section, every electric motor added in the name of hybridization, each one quietly eases the compliance math. The regulation designed to reduce consumption contains a structural reward for building more vehicle, not less. The United States runs the same logic under a different name. CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy, have been footprint-based since 2012. Footprint meaning the physical floor area of the vehicle. Bigger footprint, lower required fuel economy, more lenient standard. And NHTSA, the agency that sets these standards, notes directly in its own regulatory documents that real-world fuel economy is generally 20 to 30% lower than the compliance figures used to measure performance against the standard. That is not a critic saying that. That is the agency. In the footnotes, between 2011 and 2022, following the introduction of footprint-based standards in the United States, the share of new vehicle sales classified as light-duty trucks, which includes crossovers and SUVs, went from 50% to 63%. The big three American manufacturers largely stopped building sedans, not because customers demanded it, because the regulatory structure made large vehicles commercially superior, and the industry responded to the incentive it was given. The BMW 5 Series weighed 3,300 pounds in 2000. The same car today, with mild hybrid systems added, weighs over 4,000 pounds. The M5 variant, with its full plug-in hybrid drivetrain, sits at 5,390 pounds, heavier than the truck it is supposed to outperform on a racetrack. The Audi A6 in electric form pushes past 5,200 pounds. A Mercedes Sprinter cargo van, built to carry things professionally, weighs around 4,600 pounds with an empty cargo bay. These are not engineering accidents. These are rational commercial responses to a regulatory environment that made them rational. In 2021, the European Union required manufacturers to install onboard fuel consumption monitors on every new car, not a test cycle in a controlled laboratory. Physical sensors recording actual fuel use on actual roads, reported back to the Commission annually. The first results, published in 2024 and covering 2.2 million vehicles, were not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Real-world CO2 emissions from petrol cars were 20% higher than the official WLTP certification figures. Diesel, 18% higher. The Commission described this as compatible with assumptions, which is a bureaucratic way of saying they knew, they built the gap into their projections, and they proceeded anyway. But the gap is not evenly distributed, and this is the detail that matters. Lighter vehicles showed a real-world gap of roughly 20 to 40 grams of CO2 per kilometer above their official figure. Heavier vehicles, large SUVs, luxury saloons, the class of car that already received the most generous weight-adjusted targets, showed a gap 1.5 to 2.5 times larger. The vehicles most favored by the regulatory structure also diverge most dramatically from reality when they reach the road. They get the generous ceiling and the most forgiving measurement. Both. Then there are the plug-in hybrids. PHEVs receive the largest regulatory credits in both the EU and United States systems. Enormous fleet average CO2 reductions in Europe. Federal tax incentives up to $7,500 in America. The justification is that they run partly on electricity, which reduces their emissions when charged and used as intended. The EU Commission's 2024 real-world data looked at 320,000 plug-in hybrids and found that their real-world CO2 emissions were, on average, 3.5 times higher than the official type approval values. Not 30% higher, 3.5 times. A PHEV certified at 40 grams per kilometer, a figure that makes it look almost like an electric vehicle on paper, is emitting close to 140 grams on real roads. Because the company car driver does not plug in at the hotel. Because the family charged it twice in the first month and stopped. Because once the battery is flat, you are driving a heavy petrol car that is carrying 300 or 400 pounds of unused battery ballast, and the system is still counting it as clean. The data showing that PHEV users rarely charge their vehicles has been available since 2015. Multiple studies had documented it before the regulations were finalized. Every person in the regulatory process who cared to look could have seen it. Someone decided to proceed anyway. The question worth asking is, who that served? Regulations do not write themselves. They get drafted by civil servants and then shaped by the people with the most sophisticated access to those civil servants. Technical teams, economic modelers, industry representatives with permanent offices near the agencies they are influencing. In Brussels, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, ACEA, represents the German, French, and Italian manufacturers. During the period when the current CO2 framework was finalized, they submitted detailed technical evidence arguing that the weight correction factor was scientifically necessary and fair. The manufacturers building the heaviest, most profitable cars in Europe needed a rule that protected their business model. They provided the technical case for that rule. They had the access. The rule was adopted in the form they requested. In Washington, the Big Three, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, have lobbied consistently and with documented success for lenient treatment of trucks and SUVs under CAFE. When footprint-based standards were introduced in 2012, academic economists later estimated that the credit value of increasing a vehicle's footprint or reclassifying a car as a light truck was worth several $1,000s per vehicle in regulatory compliance value. That is not a marginal number. That is a reason to restructure your entire product lineup, which is what happened. The sedan market in America did not collapse because consumers organically stopped wanting efficient cars. It collapsed because the regulation made building trucks the rational commercial choice, and manufacturers followed the incentive they had been handed. What neither set of lobbyists included in their submissions, what never appeared in the technical evidence, the economic modeling, or the regulatory consultations, was the downstream consequence. That rewarding mass would create an incentive to build heavier vehicles. That heavier vehicles would consume more fuel on real roads. That the gap between official figures and physical reality would keep widening. That the whole system would become progressively more theatrical, a performance of environmental progress rather than the thing itself. Maybe they did not model that consequence. Here is the data point I want you to sit with. The International Council on Clean Transportation documented that manufacturers across both markets systematically optimize their vehicles for the test cycles rather than for real-world efficiency. Not the way Volkswagen criminally falsified diesel results. Nothing that crude. Subtler. Tire pressures inflated to specification maximums for testing. Software calibrations that behave differently on a dynamometer than on a public road. Test weight configurations chosen to minimize recorded consumption within the permitted range. Battery preconditioning timed for test conditions. Each optimization individually defensible, collectively producing a vehicle that performs materially better in a Brussels or Detroit test lab than in your driveway. And the gap grew. After a new European test cycle was introduced in 2017, the divergence between official and real-world figures briefly shrank, then started climbing again. By 2022, it was 80% wider than in 2018. Manufacturers had learned to optimize for the new test just as efficiently as they had learned to game the old one. Now, here is the uncomfortable part. And I need you to actually hear this. You knew the official figures were optimistic. Everyone who drives a car knows this. The 30 miles per gallon car that does 24 in real life. The official figure that requires a tailwind and a closed motorway and a featherlight right foot. This has been common knowledge for 15 years. It is a running joke in every car forum, every comment section, every conversation between people who actually drive. And yet when someone said the official figures were wrong, not just optimistic, but systematically engineered to look better than reality, most of us did not get angry at the manufacturers who engineered them that way. We did not get angry at the regulators who allowed it. We called the person raising it a troublemaker, an extremist, someone who did not understand how regulations work, someone against clean transport. The engineers who tried to say that the footprint loophole was inflating fleet sizes. The researchers who showed PHEV drivers were not charging their cars. The people who pointed out that the weight correction factor was commercially incentivizing the wrong behavior. They all got the same treatment: dismissed, marginalized, accused of carrying water for the oil industry. And manufacturers kept publishing press releases about declining CO2 averages. Regulators kept announcing targets being met. Politicians on both sides of the Atlantic kept taking credit for progress that existed entirely on spreadsheets. You shared those press releases. I shared those press releases. We were doing their communications for free. Not because we are stupid, because the system was designed to make the official story feel like common sense, and the people trying to correct it feel like bad actors. That is not an accident. It is the whole mechanism. I spoke last year to an engineer I will call Daniel. Daniel spent 14 years working on lightweight vehicle structures, specifically the aluminum and high-strength steel components that remove mass from cars without compromising safety. He was good at it. When EU regulations tightened in the mid-2010s, his team became commercially important. The connection was direct: lighter car, lower consumption, lower average CO2, lower fine risk for the manufacturer. He understood the physics, he trusted the goal, and the work felt real. Then his company started leaning heavily on PHEV credits to manage compliance. The engineering brief changed. Instead of how do we remove weight, the question became how do we configure the hybrid system to perform best in the utility factor calculation on the WLTP test. His team's work, removing 3 kilograms from a door skin, finding a lighter subframe solution, was still happening, but it was no longer the strategic priority. The strategic priority was battery configuration for test performance. He raised it internally, not as a protest but as an engineering concern. The PHEV approach was adding 400 to 500 pounds to vehicles, while the lightweighting work was saving 20 or 30. Net result was a heavier car than the one he had started from, on real roads, in real conditions. He was told the compliance numbers were what mattered. The real-world outcome would improve as electric infrastructure developed. He submitted a comment to a regulatory consultation. He presented data at a small industry conference. He was polite, sourced, and specific. A journalist who attended the conference wrote a piece suggesting that engineers raising questions about PHEV credits were acting as proxies for fossil fuel interests. He did not name Daniel, but several people in the room knew exactly who was being described. He told me, "I spent over a decade trying to make cars lighter so they would use less fuel. The rules that were supposed to make that commercially important ended up making it commercially irrelevant. When I tried to say so, I got accused of being against clean transport. I was not against clean transport. I was against the weight correction factor. There is a difference." Nobody in the room seemed interested in that difference. He still works in the industry. He does not submit to regulatory consultations anymore. That is what it costs to be right too early. Here is where we actually are. The BMW M5 will depreciate hard over the next decade, while the battery inside it follows a degradation curve the recycling industry has not solved at scale. The Audi A6 e-tron consumed significant resources to manufacture a vehicle most owners will rarely charge, operating for most of its life as an expensive, heavy petrol car with a compliance certificate that says otherwise. The fuel economy figures on both window stickers were constructed in conditions that bear no relationship to the roads those cars will spend their lives on. The Mazda MX-5 Miata, honest, light, simple, and genuinely efficient in a way that requires no asterisk, will get a new generation that weighs several hundred pounds more than the current one. Because there is no commercial path for a car that does everything right by the actual physics, but nothing useful by the regulatory math. Engineers who spent careers on the honest version of this problem got moved aside. The people who got promoted were the ones who understood that the test and the road are different environments and who optimized accordingly. I want to ask you one thing before you leave. Not which side of this you are on politically. Not whether you drive an electric vehicle or a combustion car. Whether you live in Europe or America. Whether you have been on one side of this debate or the other. I want to ask, when someone in your life raised a specific, sourced concern about official fuel economy figures or emissions regulations, what did you do? Did you engage with the numbers? Or did you reach for the label that made it easy not to? Because if you reach for the label, you are not protecting the environment. You were protecting a system that protected manufacturers. And the manufacturers are doing just fine. The cars got heavier, the official figures got cleaner, and somewhere in Brussels and Washington, in the offices of associations you have never heard of, people who understood exactly what was happening marked their lobbying objectives as complete.